All right. I believe we are streaming live to a couple of destinations, Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for standing by. We're good to go, and I'm joined today by Michel Bauwens. It's been a long time coming. We've been planning this for a while, Michel. Before we get started, before we jump into it, I want to give you a little introduction here. So for those of you who are not aware who Michel Bauwens is, he is the founder and the vision coordinator of the P2P Foundation, and he works in collaboration with a global group of researchers in the exploration of peer production, governance, and property. Michel is also the director of research of commonstransition.org, a platform for policy development aimed toward a society of the commons, and a founding member of the Common Strategy Group. His three recent books, among which is the Network Society and Future Scenarios. I also have a copy of the Peer-to-Peer Manifesto, which is another book you co-authored. And we've been in conversation fairly frequently, or more frequently than we have been in the past. This year, Michel, just talking about the current state of affairs, from the pandemic to the global crisis, the economic crisis. And you had posted, I guess, where we began talking, you had posted an article on Liminal News a few months back, really when the pandemic was really kind of taking off and the economic crisis was just beginning, which I found to be very insightful. And there was a word that I've actually borrowed from you and referenced back to you, the pedagogical catastrophe. I just found that to be such a useful way of framing what's been going on. But yeah, welcome, Michel. Good to have you here. And thank you for joining Mutations.
It's a great pleasure. I've been following your work as well, and I'm really happy that you're kind of revived Gepser for a new generation, because it seemed to me it was a bit stuck in some academic niche, and not out there. And now Gepser's ideas are back in the public sphere, which I think is a very good thing.
Yeah, agreed. And I know one of the connections we've had in the past, for a while you're writing for Reality Sandwich magazine, a couple of pieces here and there, and I knew you were in the kind of extended network of integral-oriented thinkers and sort of the new wave of generalists, right? Because I think peer-to-peer as a discipline is very transdisciplinary. So
Absolutely.
Maybe for our audience, we can really start with some foundational terms and introduce what do you mean by peer-to-peer? Is this a theory? Is this a technology? It's kind of floating around on the internet, but what is it actually?
So the first thing about peer-to-peer, it's a kind of relational dynamic. So if you remember, is it 15 years ago or even 20 now with Napster? We started talking about peer-to-peer computer networks, and the basic idea is that every computer is autonomous, and any message can go from any computer to any computer without passing through a server or any mainframe. So, the agent is free to connect. And so you can use that for computers, but actually once you have it in computers, you also have it between people. So we now have a technical reality that 2, 3, 4, maybe 7 billion people are able to connect with each other freely without asking permission. And so with peer-to-peer, you can scale small scale dynamics at a virtual global scale. That's very important. The Dunbar number. So that was the idea that we can really only process and trust 150 people. And so when we're in a village, we can solve conflicts by talking to people. It can be democratic, but once we scaled up, we invented hierarchy, to keep communication costs down, because they don't work at scale. And so that meant that big would win from small in the whole of human history. After the first period of tribal organization, that was the rule. And now we have, because of the peer-to-peer networks, we have the capacity to create global projects with very complex architectures like Linux and Arduino, and actually it's a collection of groups of 4 people on average, and yet we are able to, to massively coordinate these complex projects. And I think that's new. In my more utopian moments, I call this peak hierarchy, because what it means that eventually a network can win from a centralized organization, and that's, I think, something new in history. So basically, the idea then is that this dynamic, just as the printing, writing changed society. Before writing and after writing, it's a different type of society. Before and after print, there was a different type of society, and before and after networks, we will have different types of societies. So that's not to say that it's techno-deterministic. It's not magically the technology that changes everything, but the technology is an affordance, a means that allows people to organize differently. And so that's basically what I mean with peer-to-peer. And then the second step is, with peer-to-peer, you can do distributed exchange. That's just the market, but you can also do commoning, create massive scale shared resources. And they are both local and global. So we call it cosmolocal. What is light and global is shared, and what is heavy should be relocalized for obvious ecological reasons. So basically, everything now is small, local, open, and connected at the same time. You do permaculture, your feet are in the mud, but with your head, you're connected to the global permaculture community. And that's pretty new at that scale that we have now.
Yeah, and you mentioned a word. There's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of significance, I think, for even the kind of immediate ecological context that we're in, which is, you're right, this technology enables a way of organization and distribution that wasn't possible before. And it seems as almost as if our socioeconomic center of gravity is almost trailing behind the potential of these technologies and potential of the socioeconomics of peer-to-peer, right? So I know you're very interested in that trail, in terms of, how do we lessen that gap, right? And how do we actually advance or mature peer-to-peer networks as a way to kind of circumvent or overcome more hierarchical top-down organization?
I see our society and our civilization moving away from a commodity-based value regime to a contributory value regime. So I see history in terms of what is technically called the wave pulse theory of history. So seeing the history of humankind in terms of cycles, extractive cycles and regenerative cycles. So basically, in any competitive system, whether it's for land or labor or capital, any competition for scarce resources is an iterative game that leads to oligarchy and concentration. And even the winners in the game, in order to win that competition, will tend to overuse their resource base. And so biophysical economists, also Peter Turchin, cryodynamics, Karl Polanyi, the double movement, Sorokin, his shift from sensate to idealist, ideationist civilizations, all these things converge around this kind of similar understanding that when a competitive system overreaches itself, there's a kind of collapse, and then there's a regenerative moment. And in this moment, the commons play a huge role, because commoning is mutualization. So look at the end of the Roman Empire, right? You have suddenly the emergence of a global open source design community called the Catholic Church, with the Cistercians, that they are small communities that are very active in using the forests and creating agriculture. They're engineers, and they share across the whole European continental sphere all the innovations that they're making. They have a guaranteed shelter and food and a rich spiritual life at a much lower cost than the Roman elite. And so it's it's mutualization, it's sharing knowledge, and it's also relocalization. And so in every crisis, this is what you see, is that this kind of response is there, and the commons is a central institution to mutualize. And it used to happen at a regional scale, where you can see these cycles, and until basically the beginning of capitalism, which kind of put a temporary stop to it because of the technology, the productivity, and their ability to source a lot more out of the earth than previous forms of civilization. But then what happened is, because we kind of suppressed it, we now are at a global scale at the same situation of earlier civilization, with that difference that there's nowhere to escape. And so this means we actually, in my view, have to shift to a global commoning, to a global vision of a commons transition using these peer-to-peer dynamics, and at really every scale of human society.
So we would define, I guess, maybe for our audience as well, can we define what we mean by commoning? Is this a kind of mutual sharing of resources, essentially? Is that sort of the foundation of it?
So there's a kind of consensus definition that comes from the Ostrom work. So Elinor Ostrom was the kind of main economist that studied the commons in history, and she got a Nobel Prize. Was it in forgot when that was, but not too long ago. And she kind of said the following: so a commons is a shared resource, can be immaterial, free software, open design, can be material, an energy co-op, community land trusts, fisheries commons, forest commons, whatever. It is maintained or protected by a community or a group or stakeholders, and it uses its own norms and regulations. So the first thing means it's a thing. It's actually a thing. And I stress that, because some people are very metaphysical about the commons, but there has to be something in common that's real. Can be ideas, like a software, but there's something there. The second means that it's an activity, so it's a human choice. So you can't just say the ocean is a commons. It's not. No, the ocean is not managed as a commons. It's an open access resource that everybody can abuse. That's not a commons, right? So but the fact that there is a choice that you can say, okay, let's do it as a market, let's do it via state planning, or let's do it via commoning. That is a real choice that we have in every case. And then the third aspect means that it's not market and not state. It's something that is autonomously governed. So these three things come together. Now, there is a critique that I should share with you. Mainly like green thinking is saying, well, you still see humans separate from the resource. So that's a critique that people have on this kind of classic definition. My answer to that is that distinctions are useful, that even though we are part of nature and nature is part of us, we are also in some way, relatively separate from it in some ways. And it's useful to keep that in mind. And we can extend our notion of relationship and partnership to other living beings, right? So my proposal is to remain within that definition, but just to extend our definition to say, well, when we say communities, we also can mean a relationship and a partnering with bees and the worms in the earthworms. It's kind of expanding. Some call it entangled humanism. I like that, because I don't like the idea that is now very popular, after postmodernism, that there's no more difference between the humans and other beings. I think there is a difference. I think the level of consciousness is way more complex and way more integrated in human beings. And that because we're the only species that can destroy the planet, we also have much more responsibility, to steward it and to be the guardians of it, as opposed to being just, like one of the million species. I think we do have a specific role as humanity.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, you've probably seen some of my own conversations about this topic. I love, first of all, entangled humanism. That's a great description. In Gebser's work in integral theory, there's a lot of interest in how does the human world relate to the non-human world, and can they collapse into each other, or is there a new role? Is there a new relationship? And as you know, a lot of what I've been talking about is this kind of ontological shift where the human might be becoming non-human, but the non-human is also becoming human. It's a two-way street. This is, as you say, a time of entanglement. So the role of human culture, of interiorizing natural processes, is also the role of kind of exteriorizing human culture into nature. So it's an interesting transformation.
Yeah, what's good about that is James Moore, Capitalism, the Web of Life, is I think a really good book about it, and I actually have it. Well, I just moved it. I finished it yesterday, and he talks about the double internality. So capitalism absorbs nature, but nature also adapts and absorbs capital. There's a mutual reactivity to each other. But I'd like to give you like a kind of an analogy why I think humans are so special in a way still. When I work way too much, and so in the evening I have something very sinful that I do, which is I occasionally watch cat videos. And so what you see is that cats and dogs, when they are with humans, can learn to love each other. It's something that almost never happens in nature. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, but it's very rare that and so in human families you see that very often, is that they are capable, just by changing the education of the cats and the dogs as puppies, you put them together, they learn to see each other as one family. And that's something humans can do, that I don't think it's just like an organic natural process. And it's kind of like a Edenic or Adamic capacity to that's what some world religions talk about, that, right? That creating like paradise is one of our duties. And I hold on to that. I think it's a mistake to completely throw away this kind of vision of humanity.
Yeah, I would agree with you. One of the questions that are coming up that might be a good distinction for the nerds and humanities geeks out there, Ryan is asking how you compare entangled humanism to the post-humanism or post-humanism studies, which the lines kind of blur, and I know these become a little bit of hair-splitting distinctions, but I'm kind of curious if you have thoughts on that.
It's a very difficult. I wrote some essays in one of the books on post-humanism, and I made a documentary about transhumanism in the late 90s. So I've kind of thought a bit about it, but I'm not sure I'm buying it. I don't know how to say this. We have to expand our circle of care, right? That's something I learned from Wilber, which I thought was really nicely put, is, you care about yourself and your family, then you expand to your community, and you play, or, maybe your work environments, you extend your and then you become world centric. And so I think that's, and so in the sense, yes, we integrate technology, we practice biomimicry. I think seeing the animals as partners for me is very powerful, right? It's not just top-down stewardship, is peers in the world, as it were. So that is something that I prefer to kind of declaring, we're post-humanism or transhumanism. I like the word trans, but I can't use it here because it means something else, but for me, trans, it kind of integrates the old in the new. Like when you say transmodernism, I like that word, transmodernism, beyond modernism, but it's still kind of takes modernism with it. I prefer that to post, which it's closed. Post is, and I'm guilty myself. I actually talk about post-capitalism, but I also always talk about the common-centric civilization. So I stress that it has a content. It's not just post-capitalism. It's actually a common-centric civilization where the market and capital and the state have adapted to the commons being the central institution in our human future, right? So I think once we need to move from infinite growth model to a steady state model, right? So if you think about the cycles I discussed in the beginning, the degradative cycle, regenerative cycle, the new thing is that we can't afford to continue with the cycle because there's the planet is full in a way, and so we are going to have to learn to live in a steady state civilization that can live in harmony, with the planetary boundaries, right? And yeah, I forgot the thread now. I wanted to say something, but
The takeaway I'm getting so far is,
I remember. So I wanted to say that the commons is the means to that end. It's if you look at history, the only human institution that was capable of keeping resources in the long term, viable, were the commons. And if you look you look at the satellite images, you see Japan, Austria, Switzerland. Why is it so green? Because the mountain flanks are commons. They're well cared for by the villagers since generations. And there's actually a really nice example in Japan from the 16th to the 18th century, I believe. It's called the Tokugawa period, where Japan lived in harmony with its regional planetary boundaries with a fixed population. They could do it. And now think about doing this at a global scale is going to be a lot more difficult. But I don't think it's going to be impossible, especially if we know that we then have to foreground the commons, as a central human institution.
Yeah, I think that's the important point. That was what I was going to mention as well. That discussing post-capitalism, even in left communities, especially the more economic progressive left, which has been the kind of traditional left. A lot of the discussion from Mark Fisher to Jacobin, a lot of institutions like this are talking about post-capitalism and exit strategies. But really, I think what creates a much more attractive and creative, or like Mark, what's his name? Bifo Berardi talks about with futurability, like what actually creates that potency of the future. I think it's actually having something to gravitate towards. So I really like that naming it, right? It's just a common-centric socioeconomic culture. Everything else is going to revolve around it. And that gives us a kind of a structure to begin to work with, and an image or a shape of the future in a way that I think just saying after capitalism leaves us kind of hanging. It's like, okay, well, what is it?
I believe in seed forms. So the basic idea of seed forms is that before something comes in full bloom, it starts at the margins of societies by people who by choice or by necessity have to exit the dominant system, which is entering a downward spiral. So you have crisis of the system, exodus, and through this exodus the new is emerging. So maybe to give an example, there was actually a social revolution that few people know about from 1975 to 1050, something like that. There's a book about it. It's called The First European Revolution by Richard Moore. And so the real end of the Roman Empire is the 8th century. That's when the Muslims take control of the Mediterranean, and so there's no more flow of goods. That's really when Europe kind of completely implodes. So the 9th century is a horrible century of permanent warfare, rape, militias that steal the gold from the churches. And in 975, the monks of Cluny in France, with the people behind the Virgin Mary in front, start confronting the nobles and their misdeeds. And that leads to a social contract, make love, not war. So the feudals promised to marry their kids instead of fighting all the time. What was the second rule? Primogeniture, the oldest son gets everything, so they don't have to fight inside the family. And the first enclosure happens because the commoners are no longer able to hunt for meat. And that creates the necessity to farm more. So it creates a surplus in the agriculture. And these people start fleeing from the cities to the cities. And so they start inventing new things. Purgatory, right? Before purgatory, if you're Christian, you couldn't lend money because you went straight to hell. So purgatory says you can lend money, and then you buy an indulgence, and the church builds cathedrals, and there you go, you have commerce. The printing press allowed the ideas to spread much faster than the feudal powers could control the spread of it. Double entry book accounting, right? So these are all seed forms, patterns that emerge in a system that enter a change and a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And then these patterns find each other. Then they form subsystems, and eventually they start adapting the whole of society to their needs. So we have capitalism because we had capitalists, because Europe had the free medieval cities that operated with very weak, imperial and royal control. The merchants were able to grow and create their own culture and their organizations, and that became eventually the model, through the revolutions of the 18th century. So that's kind of the model. So, and by looking at seed forms, you can look at potential futures, right? And that's what I've been doing. I thought that P2P and the commons were today the equivalent of printing, the printing press. And so what is happening around that? What are people doing? What solutions are they inventing? And so that's what I do with the wiki. So the peer-to-peer theory is what I call a low theory. And it doesn't mean a theory of everything, but it's very focused on explaining this particular transition. And I think, what is likely to happen, make informed hypothesis. So it has to be true and verifiable. And if reality changes, you have to change your theory, because a lot of seeds don't grow, right? They start, but they don't get through the filter. My second criteria is simply coherence. Don't say the sky is blue there and the sky is black in another place. You have to be coherent. And then the third, and that's close to integral. The third criteria is very simply, what is the biggest, most hopeful narrative you can construct with those two first categories, right? So it's, in a way, it's quite modest, but it's very empirical. It starts from really existing practices with concepts that are forged by the communities. We try to invent very little, but we try to deduce from all these weak signals what could be underlying structures and ideas that seem to be solid and carry forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to mention too. I think I'd like to get into some concrete examples, maybe even from this year during the pandemic, because I know you've been sharing quite a few of them. But just generally speaking, I think it's a good orientation. It's very similar, as you said, to integral theory, particularly Gebser's work. I know Peter Pagani has had an influence on you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of
his work.
Pagani.
Yeah. So, and as you know, Gebser really emphasizes latencies, right? Like his entire cultural philosophy is really an approach very similar, which is what is latently expressing some kind of new cultural attitude, a new relationship with time.
I didn't realize that concordance. I mean, I'm not a Gebser specialist. I came through Wilbur.
Yeah.
And at the time of Boomeritis, I broke with Wilbur. I thought that was going too much in a neoconservative kind of direction at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was, I was in the integral politics group in the very beginning, but I left soon afterwards. And I read the Gebser, but I found it quite difficult in the beginning. And of course, Gebser focuses a lot on culture. I focus less on culture, but that's not because I think it's not important. I do. It's just a question. I'm more of a structuralist kind of thinker.
Sure.
I like the underlying structures. I think
But I
that's
think that's
yeah.
good. I mean, like this is
Yeah.
something that our we were mutually talking with Michael Brooks,
Yeah.
and it just sort of I'm layering this context in here. We can circle back to this, but one of the things that I talked about with Michael was, in terms of, let's say, a new consciousness or a new culture, we tend to avoid looking at economics and sort of the material structure of things because, that area seems like it's the most set in stone. But I also think, conversely, that's actually the area that requires the most transformation, right? So if we're looking for a center of gravity socioeconomically, we should probably look to the economic.
That's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm doing because I was a Marxist when I was in my 20s, and there's a lot of critique I could give on Marxism, but I think an enduring legacy is looking for structure, and particular class structure. I think it's unavoidable if you want to understand any society that you also look at class, and that is very important to keep looking at class. You can enrich it in an integral way, but I think it's really important. And so I look a lot at, and actually my last project that I worked this summer is an introduction to commons economics. I want to create a textbook. So how would you look at the economy and society if you foreground the commons rather than the market? So what are the consequences of that perspective? And so that's what we started doing with the co-authors is starting to bring that out. And I'm sure you agree with that. There's no perspective that can encompass everything, but every perspective illuminates something and hides some other things that you can't see precisely because you have that perspective. And so the most interesting to do, in my view, is bringing perspectives together. So what does degrowth tell us? What does post-capitalism tell us? What does post-growth tell us, right? So sustainability, regenerative approaches, transition towns, transition. I mean, there's so many approaches, and they all kind of bring something on the table. And I would say what we bring to the table is this kind of institutional vision of the commons, and the institutional logic of a post-capitalist society. That's basically, I think, what we focus.
And maybe we can lean into this a little bit now. Just concrete examples of these seed forms of the future. In terms of, we can start with this year. You can really go whichever direction you'd like. But I think that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. So I'll do first this latest period, but then I want to mention some really kind of amazing projects I've seen in the last few years. So what we see with COVID is really interesting. First of all, we see a convergent market and state failure, right? I mean, they really effed it up. I mean, it's really interesting how especially the Western neoliberal model completely failed to plan, predict. I mean, they even sold their masks last year, and also you see all these limitations, like they can't even mobilize other factories, or use vets to do stuff. So I mean, all these, how do you call it, legacy and inertia. It was terrible to see, and then you also see that without the state, 90% of the companies would have gone bankrupt. So that's a really interesting situation. Showing like quite a substantial issue with resilience. And so because of that, well, we saw that as a compensating mechanism, the commons came to the fore. So first of all, mutual aid groups that, emerged everywhere where people started helping each other. Then the second aspect would be make the makers. They mobilized massively and were able to produce all kinds of medical hardware that industry wasn't able to produce, for months. What you then also saw was that the world wasn't ready for it. So while they were making these things very successfully, the hospitals and the government were afraid to accept it because of regulatory problems, litigation problems. So this is what I work on as well. Is it calls for public commons cooperation protocols, right? And just maybe to give an example to our listeners that may not be familiar with this, in Italy there was a constitutional amendment around subsidiarity, organizing at the lowest possible level. Bologna took this to justify a Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons, which allows any citizen group to say, we want to care for this resource. In other words, we want to common. Then they talk together, they make an accord, a commons accord, and then the city acts as a convener for the support coalition for these commons projects. So they had like 100 the first year, 300 the next year. They have now 250 cities who took it over, and 1 million Italians are active in urban commons that weren't active before. So that's the power of institutional design, right? It's something is happening, but you smooth it out. You create structures and processes so that it becomes a normal thing. Rather than a hard and pioneering thing, it becomes a normal thing to do urban commoning in Italy. So that's, I think, a good example of what happened around the COVID, because what we now need, and that was happening in France with the public hospitals, they created their own kind of Bologna system. So a group of hospitals, public hospitals in Paris, created a whole process to more rapidly accept the productions of the maker spaces. So I think that was a very interesting period to look at that. It's kind of suddenly this kind of marginal movement that was, of course, well known to digital people and digital generations, but now, like, territorial policy in France is now going to be centered around makerspaces. So the Bank of Territory is now going to fund massively these, what they call in France, open source third places, as a kind of place to do territorial policy and territorial development. I think that's pretty fantastic. And there's now even a discussion in the parliament about a constitutional amendment around the commons. So you see that there's progress. It's not just like an idea and not just like grassroots. This is moving. This is probably the least in Anglo-Saxon countries, I must say. But definitely on the European continent, this is moving. And so I did a study about urban commons in Ghent in 2017, and so we mapped them out, and there were 10 times more than 10 years before. So you're talking about a tenfold growth in 10 years, and after that, studies took place for the Flanders, for Belgium, for Netherlands, for Catalonia, the same everywhere, a tenfold growth after 2008. So we are really living it. This is not just an idea. So you take the amount of open source code, it's exponential. You take the amount of urban commons, it's nearly exponential. You take the sharing economy, which has a very capitalistic side, Uber, Airbnb, but you take it complementary currencies, there's thousands of them now. So all these things are moving and scaling up, not enough, but they, I probably would guess that 2 or 3% of the urban populations today is active in commoning in some way or another, whether it's an energy co-op or collective purchasing of organic food, or co-op housing, or co-housing, or co-working. I mean, mutualization is really on the rise.
Yeah. Yes. That's certainly something I've witnessed myself, and sort of as a kind of response, of course, to the crisis and the lack of institutional support during both the biological pandemic and then the economic collapse, right? There's really been a withdrawing of support from the state, just traditionally speaking. So maybe we can keep giving a few more examples. I know you mentioned the food common study in Portugal, which was very interesting, and I know temporary, but I guess my question is how do we get to, or maybe there isn't, right? But what's the threshold to really kind of bring this more to the center? Is it going to require more pedagogical catastrophe? Is it going to require more?
Yeah, I think it will go, like in what you call it, punctuated equilibrium. So I do think that the current system. So here's the big question that we don't really have the answer for, although I tend to think it's a final crisis. So here's the idea. Is this just one of these kind of structural readjustments of capitalism, right? You had the mercantile system, the Smithian system, the welfare system, the neoliberal system. If it's just like that, so we're expecting some new kind of capitalism down the road, which will integrate a substantial amount of green and peer-to-peer in order to find some new arrangement. That's a possibility. The other possibility, which is the thesis of James Moore, is that capitalism has always grown through frontiers. So you have the commodity sphere where we exploit labor, but we always needed cheap nature. He calls it the four cheaps: cheap labor, cheap food, cheap energy, and cheap materials. Well, they're not there anymore. That's the problem. They're not there anymore. So it could actually be much more serious than that. It could be actually a post-capitalist reality that is waiting on the other side of the crisis. And so now we've entered a downward spiral, right, where all the cascading crises are reinforcing each other. And so this is going to be a pretty terrible decade, which paradoxically then also reinforces the need for alternatives, and therefore by necessity more people switch to the commons. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's first the pioneers. The pioneers are idealists that maybe they don't really need to do it because they have this kind of anticipatory vision of what needs to be done much earlier than normal people, right? And they're the ones doing it, and they're precarious and they don't earn money, and but then the second wave is by necessity. Young people don't find a job. Well, they might as well learn to keep their skills in an open source community, or they can't go to the restaurant. They might, be interested in mutualizing purchasing healthy food. They might be interested in a community land trust. I mean, all these things come, because also people have to do it as an alternative solution. So I think that is happening now. And I wanted to give you maybe some really nice examples of innovation. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, please do.
So, so this was a person in Brazil where I went several times, up to a month at a time. It's called Curto Café, and so a man from the coffee business would think, why can't we have good coffee in Brazil? Because there are four categories. A and B go to the west, so they get the crap coffee left over. And why do the people who actually make the coffee, they're nearly starving? They get like not even minimum wages. And said, can we make coffee so that we have good coffee in our country and without exploiting the worker? And he started completely redesigning it. So first step, he called it feral transparency. So he didn't want certification, because usually Western NGOs control the process and it's very expensive, etc., etc. Let's do full transparency. You know where the coffee comes from, what farmer makes it, everything about his family that you want to know. So all of that is open. All the costs, it's an open accounting system. Second step is they made a machine, a distributed coffee burning machine, grinding and burning machine, that quadrupled the income of the farmers, because they don't have to bring it to a coffee company, which takes all the profit. Third, mutualized rent, so crowdfunded rent. So they basically say, we want to be in this shopping mall. Please support us if you want good coffee. And the people who invest get free coffee. That's their dividend of their shares, right? And then they go to the shopping mall, and there they have a poster which exactly explains how much the coffee costs and why. And people, there's no waiters. The people just kind of give what they want for what you call it, like a token. And then they actually also hacked the Nescafe machines, the Nespresso machines, so that you can actually renew them yourself without buying new ones. I mean, can you imagine what an innovation that means? Like in every single step, they've used network technology and sharing and transparency to completely reform the supply chain in something that is, what is it? It's not a company. It's a community. It's a commons, and everybody is happy. The farmers are happy. The coffee users are happy. Everybody in the chain has a role and work. I mean, and so they had a little store when I went there the first time. And last year they have two huge hangars. Is that the right word in English? These like empty factories that they took over.
Hangars.
And so they're trying now to move into beer and cheese and chocolate using the same model. Amazing. Okay, next example, also from Brazil. Fora de Eixo is very poor kids in northeastern Brazil that said, why are musicians so poor here? And so they started mutualizing the studios and the equipment for musicians. So musicians go to them and they don't have money, so they kind of go on credit. And they have a credit card with 4 different complementary currencies. And one of them is studio time. So then they organize the concerts and they keep a percentage to pay back the credit that was in advance with the studio time. And they have their own university, they have their own bank, they have their own media. And I went to one of these houses. They had 15 communes and 300 collectives. And in a commune that was like totally collective, and you basically have a suitcase full of money where the members responsibly can take whatever they need to live. You see, again, a completely different approach to production and consumption, where it's an ecosystem. The musicians, the young people, they all kind of work together. So that's what I like. It's this kind of fundamental innovation in, not just economic models, but social models, right? And what's great about peer production, commons-based peer production, is that people start from their intrinsic motivation. Like you do what you like, and you do it in a community that's all oriented around the same social object. And because you're all freely contributing in an open system, you cannot have simple hierarchical relationships, because if I don't pay you, why should you listen to me? Right? And so what happens in the commons is that the motivation and the passion comes first. That creates the community, and the community creates the economy. Because everywhere where there are people, there's an economy. But the logic is inverted. You don't just look for a job hoping that you might like it. You exercise your passion, and you create an economic life around. And I'm pretty sure that's what you did, and that's what I do, right? Mm-hmm. And then slowly create people who believe in the same object. And ours is very simple. We peer produce knowledge about peer production. That's our social object.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And these are very hopeful examples, I think, at this time. One of the critiques, which I think is just from a sheer lack of awareness of how peer-to-peer commons are proliferating right now. And really, if you think about it, and this is sort of what the message I kind of grokked from the late David Graeber, the anthropologist, and that, if you push away a lot of this extra kind of ideological stuff, like people want to socialize, they want to connect with one another, right? The commons is human-centric because it's community-centric, and out of that flows, material interests, material desires, material production, right? We want to be in a community and thrive together. So what do you want to create? So I guess my question is, because there's a number of people asking about examples in particular countries. I've heard quite a bit, and this is something I brought up to Ben Burgess as well. The Mondragon example, worker cooperatives, as something kind of more leaning towards this direction. Although I think what you're talking about is really a much
Yeah, well, I see the co-ops as the commons of the labor movement. So
Mhm.
remember, so first we had natural resource commons, right? And they were primary. Even in a feudal society, commons were very important. So I like to tell the story about the Rogentide procession, which was the most important collective ritual in medieval villages, which is every year the village would, have a procession around and confirm all their commons. It's also called beating the bounds. So it was really constitutive of their very identity was commons centric. This is what constructs the parish is, partly our belief, our joint belief, but it's also that we have these commons that constitutes our human community, right? But then capitalism encloses the commons, and so all these chased away peasants become workers in the city where they die when they're 32, and 80% of their kids die, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's terrible until 1850, 60. It's terrible situation, and they create the mutualization of risk, right? So all of these things like fraternities, mutualities, social insurance, they're actually social commons that were created by the working class to manage their life's risk that the state was not yet taking upon itself. So while the physical commons got privatized, the social commons got statified through the welfare system. And so co-ops, I have some. I mean, I think co-ops are very good, but they have two weaknesses. One is managerialism. So over time, they tend to create a separate managerial elite. And second, because they have to compete in a capitalist society, they become worker capitalists. So and that's like a good example would be Mondragon. When they go to Poland, they don't want to hire. They don't want to accept the Polish workers in the co-op because that dilutes their bonus. And so then they're going to hire the Polish workers on a minimum wage, and then they're going to have a strike against Mondragon, right? And that is a structural weakness of co-op. That's why I propose open co-ops as an alternative. And an open co-op is a co-op that is structurally aligned to the commons. So in its very statutes, it says we're not just working for ourselves, our co-op members, we are actually working for the whole of society, and we are going to produce something for the common good explicitly. So if a co-op uses free software, it creates software that's good for the whole world. If the housing co-op in Quito, this is a real case, cleans up the ravines and makes it into a public park, it's good for the co-op members because they have a nice park next door, but it's also good for all the other citizens that can use a public park, right? So I think that's where co-ops should go. Co-ops should integrate the commons in order to have a kind of a next generation co-op.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the old co-ops, they're better than, in my view, better than a for-profit company, but they still have these two structural weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. That's a helpful distinction because I've seen a lot of promotion about Mondragon, and I've seen a lot of movements, let's say platform cooperativism, which had a very interesting conference in New York City I attended. I know they regularly do this. So I really appreciate your distinction that it should be or ought to be structurally aligned with the commons. And it seems like there's concrete strategies for doing that. Let's kind of shift. I mean, I feel like we're going to need another hour to in the coming weeks or maybe next month or something to get to more of the material. But for the time being, I'd love to just sort of bring in more questions from our listeners here. And Lucy Evers, let me just.
Oh, I don't have very well.
Yeah, okay. Yes, there's a huge failure of imagination. This is a little bit earlier, just talking about, post-capitalism. And then, let's see, we did have a question from, if I can get it over here. Here we go. Yeah. Dennis was asking what commons resources were addressed in Bologna.
Okay.
He's asking for specifics there.
Yeah, so that's kind of the critique of the model. That is, what is it? Squares, abandoned factories, parks that were not well maintained, empty buildings, right? So that's a critique you could have on the Bologna model, that it's it's designed for kind of not structural commoning. So I didn't mention that because I'm actually happy that what is so important in Bologna is that public commons cooperation protocol. I think that's kind of like why it's so important and as a societal advance. But then in practice, it's not sufficient because it's only commons, particular, very local, smallish type of projects. So that's a potential weakness. But what you also have to see, of course, if you have a lot of them, that starts counting anyway, right? It's you're not talking about 1 building, you're talking about 300 projects. That really starts to change the city anyway. So structural commoning, so this is one of the things that I look at. We need to mutualize our provisioning systems, right? So one of the things we need to systematically look at, as public policy, how do we mutualize our urban provisioning systems? And there's a movement that I really like. It's called Factor 20 reduction. And John Takara knows a lot about that. You should maybe talk to him once. He's an absolutely great ecological designer, lives in the south of France, is English. And for example, there's one report that shows that if we use mutualized cargo bikes and pedelecs, these electric bikes, we can save 98% of energy usage for the same level of merchandise. I mean, that's absolutely amazing, right? So this is one of the things we need to do. And then when I talk about cosmolocal production, I'm actually talking about the next phase of commoning. So you had the physical commons, the social commons of working class, the digital commons, the urban commons. But urban commons, they are more about redistribution. They're not about production. So like you don't make the house, but you do a co-op ownership. But you still need a firm to make it. The next step is productive ecosystems. That's really important. And so for an example that is a first example, but I think is quite significant, is there are now craftspeople all over Europe that work with materials, steel, plastic, wood, 3D printing. There's 120 of them. They mutualize their work in a factory. And then they have the invisible factory where they share their designs, coordinate collective work. And so again, it's very local. They do stuff locally in the city, but they are connected at the European level in this multi-factory network. So I think that's a good example of an emerging, actually productive ecosystem, right? So the next step then is, and this is what I wrote in 2019 in P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival, is to ask the question, what is the ideal cyber physical infrastructure that we would need to produce for human needs within planetary boundaries? So, totally integrate all the so-called externalities so they become visible. So first of all, we need accounting because accounting is how we see the world. And the current accounting is double entry accounting, is narcissistic accounting. What comes in, what goes out, how much capital and profit do I keep for myself? There's no vision of the ecosystem. There's no vision of nature. So we need contributive accounting, which is accounting for contributions. And this is the big revolution. That this is what I'm trying to explain to everyone. We now have a cumulative value regime. This means we have to exploit people and nature, create a surplus through extraction that we then reinvest in generative and compensatory activities through tax or philanthropy. But that means that the generative activities are marginalized, right? We believe value comes from the market, and then a part of that is punctured to fund something else. What we need is to realize that contributions is value. So making people more happy, better, and improving and regenerating nature, right? So that is what is wealth. And so we should reorganize our economy based on the unit of contribution. So contributive accounting does that. And there's many, many examples. Ecosystem accounting, this is called resources, events, agents. So instead of having blind double entry accounting, what you have is every action you do is visible in 3D and it displays in the ecosystem. And then the third one is actually integrating thermodynamic flows in the accounting systems. So you have global thresholds and allocations, and that is translated and distributed in all accounting systems, that you have context-based sustainability. This is called r3o.org, very important project. So all three of them exist in various prototypal and experimental forms, and so you kind of have to put them together. And then what you get is a three-layered economy, which the basic layer is stigmergy, open mutual coordination. That's what's happening in the open source production. Every coder can see all the code. It's a holoptical system, not panoptical, but holoptical. You can see it from every angle. And so an individual can adapt in real time his behavior to the needs of the ecosystem. On top of that, you build generative market functions for rare resources. So for example, the fish coin is a coin that knows how much you can fish without destroying the reproduction capability of the fish, right? So that's the second level. So the market is recognized and integrated. And the third level is orchestrated planning. So what the function of state planning would be. But instead of telling people what to do or to ration, what you say is these are the outer limits, and in between you're free, but here are the outer limits, and you can see them, and so they can inform every decision that you make. And all the tools that we need, they're ready. They just need to be integrated and applied and be made competitive. And so that's what I'm looking at, distributed ledgers as a public policy resource. So imagine you want to decarbonize. Now we do competitive procurement, winner take all, or we do speculative carbon markets, which don't work. Well, why don't we say to all citizens, individually or collectively, you can declare your contribution. It will be peer reviewed and verified, and you get tokens. And these tokens are paid either to taxation because it's a recognized public priority, or by institutions that are willing to share their externalities that they get from your activity. And a good example is the Community Land Trust in France, Terre des Liens, calculated already in 2016 that they saved the French state 350 million euro in depollution of water costs that they don't have to do because organic farmers don't pollute the water. So you need a system whereby the state or big corporations recognize that they are profiting, from positive externalities, and then part of the gains are shared. And so what you get is kind of generative funding directly for contributory activities. So that's, for me, is the future. We have to see that wealth comes from contributions, not from commodity extraction. We probably need both. I'm sorry, I talk a lot, but
no.
So if you, for example, Bernard Lietaert, who was a Belgian economist who actually created the euro, co-created the euro, he said that pre-capitalist systems had dual currency systems. The money of the king, based on taxation, because he needed to pay soldiers. And so then people would get in debt, and they would need the money to pay back the debt, and that would then fund eventually the royal army. But they also had commons money, so yin and yang money, or cold and warm currency. And you still have that, for example, in Bali, where the watershed systems are funded by a separate coin. So we need to get back to that system. I'm not sure that a 100% contributory regime would be possible, because I do think we need to extract, right? We are natural beings, and we've been designed that way, that we need to eat. even if you're vegetarian, you still need to extract, plants. So I think we probably need both, but we do need to shift to the primacy of contribution in the kind of next civilizational system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points. And I think I'd like to switch over to, let's see. This is a good question, and it kind of relates to what we're talking about in terms of scaling. Or let's go to Lucy's comment first, that the small stuff is important but needs to scale. That's how we come to cosmo-localization, or glocalization, as I call it, as Lucy calls it. And then related to that question, Oriana was asking about the role of institutions is to scale up citizen initiatives, but how is it done when institutions are corrupted?
All right. Well, so the first way to scale is viral, and that's happening all the time. Like permaculture, it works, so everybody's doing it. So it didn't need the state to scale, and it's scaling horizontally. But I believe that's not enough. So one of the things that I've proposed to the cities that I work with is this idea of using leagues of cities as governance mechanism. So think about it. So we need to mutualize these provisioning systems. Instead of Airbnb, we need Fairbnb. Instead of Uber, we need ride-sharing co-ops, etc., etc. But what would be enormously wasteful would be for every single city to develop its own software to do this, right? So this is called a protocol co-op, a global open design depository that is managed by a coalition of cities, supported by a coalition of ethical and impact finance and co-ops and solidarity economy, but then can be applied locally by co-ops or anybody else, right? So you mutualize and scale by using cities in this case. You don't need necessarily nation state. So that's one of the ways. And so public commons cooperation protocols, for example, there's this discussion in America about a Good Samaritan law. So one of the ways to facilitate the adoption of these, distributed makers would be to say, well, in times of crisis, we need to abandon some of that top-heavy regulation that prevents small players to be active and innovative, right? So we need commons law. We need a whole arsenal. So we need to redesign our institutions, and we also need all kinds of legal adaptations because our system was made for the binary state and private.
Mm-hmm.
The commons was completely marginalized. And I once talked to General Orsi in the US, and if I remember correctly, what she said was, do you know that it's forbidden in the US to dry your clothes in the sun? Do you know it's forbidden in the US to collect rainwater? Do you know it's forbidden in the US to grow vegetables in front of your house, etc., etc., etc.? So we're citing all these county regulations that exist. And they're all designed to protect the market, the scarcity of the market, right? They're anti-commons. And so the good news is that in France, did I talk to you that there is a constitutional amendment for the commons being discussed? Maybe not. So that's one thing that's happening.
You raised that point.
Oh, okay. But the second thing is that so you have 26 regions in France, and the 27th region is actually an administrative commons. So it's where all the functionaries can work and research together. And so last year they studied the commons, and this year they're studying commons law. I mean, that's fantastic for me. I get brain gasms from this. So, it's dark times and many things are going badly. But, if you put yourself in the place of the imaginal cell of the caterpillar, don't focus on you becoming mush, but focus on the butterfly that's waiting on the other side of the tunnel, right? And that is basically one of the things that I want to help doing, is to show people what's on the other side potentially, and so then I can focus their constructive energies instead of becoming despondent by the decline of what we have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, as Marx actually said, we need to listen to the poetry from the future. But I love your usage of the imaginal cell. That's something that comes up quite a bit in our communities. And, I encourage, I think there's a mix of peer-to-peer listeners who are part of your community and your online networks. There's folks from the integral community who are listening. There are folks on the kind of the digital left, sort of internet left, listening here. And I think, the good news is, despite this being a very dark time, is that we kind of have to expect this. And maybe like for our follow-up session, we can kind of deep dive more with integral theory and Gebser and Pagani, actually, because I know Pagani talks quite a bit about these, as you mentioned, bifurcation points, right? So I think having a lay of the land makes it a little bit, if not, easier to accept, then at least gives us a little bit of hope,
I want to maybe address one thing, which is the corruption, right? Because that seems to be an important question. So let me first say that my approach is about reverse cooptation. Generally speaking, a lot of people on the left will always complain about, yes, but it will be corrupted. Yes, it will be taken over. Yes, it will be co-opted, and it's kind of like a self-defeating. Of course, these things are happening, but if you only focus, then you're basically destroying your own, will to change, because you're always already seeing defeat before it even happens. So what you have to think of is reverse cooptation. Not how capitalism is going to eat you, but how you are going to eat capitalism, right? So what kind of market mechanisms work for the commons? How can I do transvestment, which means changing capital into commons? And what kind of techniques? So we really need to think positively in terms of solutions and say, how can we adopt market and state to our needs? And the corruption issue is, is function of our current system. It's structural corruption, right? So what happened is we built nation states, and they're trying they co-emerge together, and they're 3 in 1. If one is under attack, the two others will help it survive. The problem is that capital has detached itself. So we now have transnational capital, and the nation and the state no longer have the power to challenge it. So before this, in Polanyi would talk about the double movement, and what he said that every 30 years or so, the market frees itself from society and the state and starts doing bad things, and then the people, the nation, revolt and force the state to re-regulate and re-embed the market. And that's no longer working. That's it. I mean, it's organically working in the sense that it emerges. So we have left and right-wing populism, which are exactly these kinds of reactions, right? I analyze Trump as, giving up empire for the nation, and analyze the right-wing Democrats as choosing empire above the interest of the local people. But it can be on the left, can be on the right, but you see people mobilize, they want change. But national politicians have very little say. Even America have, not as much power against that global financial power. So what do we need to do? And I know this is a long term. I don't see any other solution. So one of the solutions is to create translocal and transnational power. So if we're in the commons, and the digital commons particularly, our feet are in the mud, but we're connected with these global networks, and then we have to use that organizational and institutional power. We have to form planetary guilds. We have to form planetary streams of commons-based capital, etc., etc. So we have to become, in parallel with capital, we have to make strong and stronger commons, so that we can also, put pressure on the state, which is a power that we lost. And politicians lost their power as well. So if they're corrupted, it's also because they can't really do that much. You know what I mean? So this is, so I understand why, some people on the right are wanting to restore the sovereign state. So I predict that in the next decades, that is part of our reality, is that far from disbanding, a lot of countries will actually reinforce the nation state. But there's a lot that the nation state can solve. So even if they do that, what about Fukushima? What about the global collapse of the food production capacity? I mean, there's so many things that you cannot solve at the nation state level.
Yes.
So that's why that will never be enough. We need this translocal, transnational. And you notice I'm not saying international, right? That is a big difference. And so the big challenge for humanity is to combine geographical governance, maybe bioregional, and strengthening the local democracy and territorial development through the commons and everything we can do. But then the other side we cannot forget is that we have to manage and govern the flows. And so I think in some way that commoners are creating virtual nations, right? We can call them guilds, doesn't matter, but they're creating like instituted communities. And I live in Chiang Mai, and think maybe then we kind of close with this. I live in Chiang Mai, which before COVID was the global capital of nomadic work. 25,000 people in one Facebook group, and they're working remotely. The web designers, developers, lots of blockchain people. Mozilla Foundation is here, and they work here, and they're organized. They have their own, like the embassy, which is a network of apartments all over the world. They go from here to Medellin to Tenerife. They have their circuits. So these people are actually building something that that is what I'm talking about. They use the nation state as translocal workers. So the most libertarian amongst them have this called a six flag theory, which says, okay, put your NGO there, pay your taxes there. They kind of use the nation state from a trans nomadic point of view. I think that's kind of interesting to see that. And I think that will happen as peer production grows, as we create these open design communities. This is another part of the world that is growing and that will kind of co-determine how we organize the planet.
Well said, and it's a good place to conclude. We have a lot of questions that would take us in very different directions, so let's bookmark those for the next time. I'm seeing a kind of cluster of, let's see, like talking about blockchain, the kind of digital end of things, and then some other folks are also kind of asking for more of the cultural evolutionary questions. So let's do that with the Pagani Gepser technology deep dive. But thank you so much, Michel. This was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks for the really stimulating questions, because that counts just as much as the person who's there. Yeah,
certainly. Thank you, Michel, and we'll have you back on soon. And thanks everybody for watching with us. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.